There's definitely some new faces. So I will say this again. This is the Solidarity and Mental Health Summit, where our question of today is, how does incarceration affect mental health? So this is part 2 for y'all who aren't aware. We have some beautiful, beautiful, amazing, outstanding panelists joining us today. So let's go ahead and introduce them. Down here with the beautiful yellow on with her melanin shining is Linda Lane, who is a probation officer at a juvenile center. So can we give it up for Linda? Thank you. Next to her, we have Kasper Cinder, co-founder and director of ABO Comics. So let's give it up for Kasper. Next to Kasper, we have Liliana Campos, who's a doctoral student. So let's get up for Liliana. Oops, sorry, y'all. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Alex Garcia, who is a history and ethnic studies teacher at Merritt College. Yes. Then as we come over here, we have Alex Zhang, the co-founder of the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. Please get up for Alex. Then after Alex, we have Mr. Raymond Banks, who's a part of Urban Scholars and who was also formerly incarcerated. Oh, this is not looking good. Hi. Is that Tyler? Okay. Tiger. Okay, I was just making sure. Okay. Then we have Tiger Blair, who is currently with Rafiki Coalition as a program manager and also a volunteer. So please, again, can we get up for our panelists? Thank you, thank you. Okay, welcome all. I am just gonna get into our first question. So the first question is, how does incarceration affect the emotional health of African American, Latino, Native, LGBTQ, and undocumented communities?
Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Garcia. Just want to mention also, I'm also formerly incarcerated. I'm also identify Native American, and also, I guess, in that box, I get boxed into the Latinx, kind of because of my trajectory with, nation state creations and things like that. Anyhow, I guess I'm gonna talk about my trajectory from, I guess you could say post-incarceration, through the pipeline of graduate school or school in general. And I think one way that it affected me, I think this work that's happening right here, first of all, it's really good, because when I started, it was a taboo. Right? Nobody wanted to talk to me. I couldn't even mention it. Say, hey, I'm formerly incarcerated. As soon as I brought that up, a lot of faculty, staff, they ran. They ran. And I guess no one really realized how big of a problem that was and how many students who are formerly incarcerated actually attend community colleges. And so the way that it affects mental health to me, and maybe I believe it echoes some of my other relatives who have been incarcerated or who are, or who are currently, on probation or parole or whatever, they're still incarcerated, believe it or not, because the state can just come and snatch them up anytime, right? It's a different type of situation. So just think about that. I think the way that it affects me, maybe a metaphor that is helpful for us understanding is, you feel like you're tangled up in a spider web, and that spider can just come easily and snatch you up, wrap you up in a nice little package, and suck a little bit of blood out of you, and then kind of leave you there held until you figure out a way to disentangle yourself, if that helps. So that's the way I felt navigating, going through the channels, hopping, and it only takes very few people, right? You identify certain people that are willing, even to get this job, right? I'm gonna be honest with you. Identify a few people, even to this job, because I have applied And I'll tell you, you can look it up if you don't believe me. I applied and I did work. They used my labor over there at Los McDonald's Community College, right? They needed somebody to be filled in, and I went and I was like, hey, and I try to be sincere and up forward. They snatched me up, used me, and then when they didn't really want to keep me, they were like, okay, you have a record. Sorry, we can't keep you. And so I knew that. I knew those consequences. So again, thinking about it from school, going to school. So the way that it affected me and the way that it probably affects a lot of the relatives who have been formerly incarcerated is that's cool that we have these summits. That's cool that we are educating you and we're giving people education. Some of them call it the school to prison pipeline. I want to push that a little bit more. I want to say that the thing that troubles us is not the school from prison to school, is from prison or incarceration to an actual profession. You know what I mean? I have people here, and I guess I want to, basically thank the people that have been behind me, helped me out here and there, and here I am, teaching at Merritt College, and this is sort of what I bring up. So this is something that basically is behind us, and just want to acknowledge one relative that really helped me out, Scott. He's over there. He's one person that I was able to say, hey, Scott, people like me here, but look, this is the big question that's gonna arise. And Scott said, hey, it might be instead of looking at it as a liability, I still remember the words. He said it might be an asset, and I think it is. That's what he said. And I go, well, let's roll with that.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
My name is Raymond Banks. I might want to respond a little differently. Yes, I am formerly incarcerated, if you want to use that term. But I like to look more on the positive side. I graduated from Cal with a degree in philosophy, undergraduate degree in philosophy. But more importantly, I think I have more of a philosophical response to this issue. I also tutor the student athletes in writing and philosophy. So one of my students was writing about prison or incarceration, and he labeled this model the inhumane model of prison management. And he talked about the research shows or suggests that there's a causal link between harsh prison conditions and deprivation and various psychosocial, emotional, physical harms, such as sexual trauma. In order to illustrate these linkages between harsh prison conditions and the psychosocial traumas, he uses Gorski's theory of post-incarceration syndrome. And I just want to raise the community's awareness about this thing. You can Google it yourself. The person's name is Terence Gorski. And Gorski goes on to say that PICS, or prison incarceration syndrome, is a set of symptoms that are present in many currently incarcerated and recently released prisoners that are caused by being subjected to prolonged incarceration in environments of punishment with few opportunities for mental health and medical services, education, job training, and rehabilitation. So in response to that question, I think there needs to be a systemic change beginning inside the prisons and in order to impact what comes outside the prisons. And I don't necessarily think it's necessarily race-related.
Thank you.
Well, I'm Tiger Blair, and my answer to that question is that incarceration is a profound manifestation of inhumanity, and it began in this Western civilization construction and the way that it has gone through the world from certainly the time this country has begun, and it continues into the way incarceration looks today. There is no way such brutality could not impact the mental health of anyone who is in it. And the curious thing is there is no way that mental health issues cannot be impacting the ones who are doing it and enforcing it. So incarceration in the system that it is certainly a recapitulation of horrible, brutal slavery and annihilation of peoples and the trauma of white supremacy that has been enacting in whiteness since the term whiteness has come into consciousness. All of it is a mental health is reprehensible and it is a mental health issue. The compassionate way that I'm trying to deal with it is how do we begin to confront all of these mental health issues. It is not just a one-sided thing. As in my volunteering in San Quentin, what I continually say to the administration as I'm dealing with the victim offender group work and trauma work with the men inside is that this is not going to be as impactful if I don't get those correction officers and then I don't get the management of San Quentin. They also have to go through this process as well in order for this to actually work. So this mental health issue is pervasive, not just in the prison system, but in our country and in this whole society, as we can even see with the way that our government is being run now. Clearly, there is a mental health issue at the helm of that system. We as a people have to begin to look at how do we begin to compassionately work with this mental health issue that exists within our society.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Linda Lane, and thanks again for having me here today. When I look at my perspective of does incarceration impact mental health, I always go back to the beginning of saying, have we been preventive? And oftentimes when we talk to the adults who are suffering from mental health, it started in childhood, and it went unnoticed, it went undealt with. And so when we are now being incarcerated, a lot of mental health issues come out. I have not worked with the adult population directly, but in working with the youth, when they come in and we try to do assessments, only then, under those what we consider harsh circumstances of being locked inside of a room, then we get to see and address there's some mental health issues going on. And then we have to begin to delicately separate the mental health from the crime. So we know why we have the jails, and that we know the design of the jails, that they are not designed to strengthen people, but now we're seeing the impact that the jails are having on people mentally, so now we have to address that. And so in juvenile, my take on dealing with juvenile is bringing the mental health providers, bringing the mental health people that understand the delicacies of mental health into the prison, because a prison guard wasn't trained on mental health. A warden wasn't trained on mental health. Their priority is safety and keeping things of that nature. That's their priority. So we have to balance this scale to say, how do I keep people safe? But I do have to address the mental health. So in juvenile, my time in sharing with juveniles is that we have to bring them in, because a lot of times their mental health doesn't even manifest until they're in the prison system. When you talk to the school, they've seen things, and we can sometimes go all the way back to kindergarten where things were being documented but not addressed in regards to mental health. So now they're in prison, or they're in custody, as we would say for juveniles. Now we see this mental health, and it has to be dealt with, but now we're trying to balance the scale of the ability for them not to commit another crime based on the mental health, or are they committing crimes because they just want to be a criminal? So it's a thin, is how I would address it. It's a very, very thin line. And so yes, the incarceration is impacting mental health, but the question is how are we going to deal with it? Can we deal with it in custody? Because some are going to have to be dealt with in custody, and some need to be dealt out of custody, but it has to be dealt with. And as many of us who have worked with mental health, we need to see what it is, we need to address it, and then we have to have the buy-in, because the person who may be incarcerated may not sense that they have some mental health issues that need to be addressed. So it's that conversation that we have to keep trying to balance the scales of crime and the mental health. And then how do we do the work that needs to be done that they can be functional in society? Because again, when we're looking at incarceration, we're seeing sometimes victims, sometimes we're seeing death, and sometimes, we're just seeing things that are brutal and unrepairable in some sense. So we have to always, sort of look at those things and say, what do we see? How can we address it? And how can we get them back into society so that they can be functional? But it has to be addressed. So yeah, it does impact.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. I think one of the things that comes to mind for me as I think about the mental health effects of incarceration, when we think about Latino Black men being incarcerated, when we think about fear of deportation, fear of detention, when we think about the criminalization of Black and brown bodies, for me, I always go back to liberation psychology and trying to understand the systems, the sociopolitical, sociocultural structures that are set in place and strategically made as constructs to keep people sick, right? So when we think about the ongoing effects, the mental health effects of colonialization, right? When we think about the different systems, whether it be incarceration, whether it be undocumented legal status, we do need to understand that these systems have been created specifically to keep people sick. So for me, before I even begin as a developing researcher, as a clinician, in trying to understand the mental health outcomes of various types of fear, fear of microaggressions, fear of hate speech, fear of crime, fear of detention, I need to understand, before I even begin to pathologize and diagnose these symptoms, these presenting symptoms, right? We need to understand these systems, right? And I think one of the things that for me that was very powerful in hearing Eddie speak was going back to your chi, right? That healing, going back to your culture, going back to your history, knowing your identity. And I think that is really powerful when we think about liberation, when we think about what it means to be liberated, not only from these systems, but being liberated from our minds, right? And so I think for me, knowing that these systems specifically target Latino, brown men, Black men, right? We cannot deny race is a factor there. We cannot deny that race is a social construct to criminalize these specific communities. And so for me, I try to be very, very careful when I think about pathologizing our community because we are responding to these systems, right? These chronic levels of stress that our bodies experience every day, whether it be through discrimination, marginalization, oppression, right? We know that they're coming from these systems that are set in place to create this stress, this chronic trauma. And so I think that's, for me, where social justice and mental health intersect, right? And they cannot exist without one or the other. We need to be able to address both at the same time and figure out, yes, actions that are needed to address this issue. Whether it be systemic, whether it be interpersonal, right, in our daily lives. I think for me, that's when I think about really breaking down these barriers and really understanding the socio-political structures that are set in place to keep communities of color sick.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kasper. Thank you so much for coming out. This has been such an amazing event. Just some background, I run a small press and prisoner advocacy organization here in Oakland called ABO Comics, and we work primarily with LGBTQ people experiencing incarceration to help try and amplify their voices, publish their stories, and help heal trauma through creative expression. And so we work with over 200 currently incarcerated queer people across the US right now. And they submit so much of their art to us, just expressing, what they go through in prison and their mental health status. And something that I've seen routinely is that prisons are not equipped to deal with mental health issues in general, but specifically the LGBT population, where so much information is coming out on a daily basis. This is not a lot of information that mental health professionals in the free world have in general, so prisons are just not equipped to work in solidarity with queer people. So we see oftentimes gender nonconforming or transgender people have difficulty accessing the medical care that they need, specifically hormones or gender affirming items. And I know personally that if I don't have my hormones, I want to light things on fire. So I can't even imagine what it's like to go week after week experiencing severe gender dysphoria or being put in situations like indefinite solitary confinement for people's protection. I've had friends who have literally been sold into sexual slavery because they are put in prisons that do not align with their gender identity and they are preyed upon. So I definitely think prisons, of course, affect the mental health of LGBT people and anybody experiencing incarceration. So I'm very grateful that we can have this conversation today.
The way some of the research is presented, it seems that people didn't know what the effects of incarceration were going to be. And I don't know if you're familiar with a book called Discipline and Punishment by Michel Foucault. And Foucault posits that perhaps one should reserve the problem and ask oneself, what is served by the failure of prison? What is the use of these different phenomena that are continually being criticized? And he goes on to demonstrate the maintenance of delinquency, the encouragement of recidivism, the transformation of the occasional offender into a habitual delinquent, the organization of a closed milieu of delinquency. This was written in 1831. So people have known for almost 200 years what prison actually does to people. I just wanted to make that point.
So I'm going to pose the second question, which is, how does incarceration affect the mental health of a culture?
That question is kind of in line with like my research. So I'm finishing up a dissertation also here at UC Berkeley. And I basically look at youth culture, specifically looking at the cultures of Black and brown peoples of Los Angeles. And so I'm kind of going off a little bit on that, but I'm also going off of my own experience and things that I know. And the way that it affects, I think, it generally changes the culture of people. So my research looks at the relationship between young people and the rise of mass incarceration, what we probably call mass incarceration, the structural, the physical ones, which basically get implemented in the 70s as a response to what I refer to, actually not refer to, but I also, alongside scholars like Ruthie Gilmore, right, basically talk about mass incarceration as a response to the second Reconstruction, right? Also Angela Davis and them are talking about, there's a movement of civil rights. And in the first Reconstruction, you have a movement for civil rights and you get Jim Crow. And so in a sense, we have the national Jim Crow after what happens in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And so there's a response, and the response is to incarcerate people. Now, me knowing this, I know that basically before I was even born, there was already a plan for me to go to prison, Now, not many people know that, but if you look at policy, if you look at the creation of the relationship between the funding that gets placed into California in general, right, you will see that there was structures, buildings being created in a time when crime was actually in a decline. So it doesn't make sense, right? These things don't parallel. Crime does not parallel the rise of prisons. And so you look at a lot of the work that's out there already points to that. Anyhow, how does that affect the culture? Well, I grew up in that, and that's something I refer to in my dissertation as a carceral youth culture, right? Where the mental health of young people, right, is somehow, you can say, informed or contaminated, right, by policies of incarceration, whether they be the official ones that we can see, like 3 strikes, you're out. But there's also the informal ones, right, that come out from the carriers, right, of these ways that people are impacted by incarceration. What I mean by that is, there's young people who navigate social life, right, thinking of institutions, but not directly calling them institutions, but they're thinking about these institutions, and one of them that's predominantly in their present, right, framework is the prison, the incarceration. And their immediate access, right, versus college is the police, right? The police right there is already there policing them. Policing happens in schools, right? From schools all the way down to, there's other scholars that say even in the home, but I disagree slightly on that angle. But nonetheless, you know, so the idea is that they have those official policies that are taking place, but then they also have their friends or loved ones, right? A whole community that's on parole, right? That's also informing them about this reality. So incarceration becomes more of a reality, more of something that they know they're going to be able to access quicker, and they're in a sense, or we are in a sense, right? People getting trained already to think in carceral ways versus, you know, succeeding in college. And one of the things that I would probably point to as a sense of evidence, I guess, in my work is when you look at just hip hop itself, right? If you look at the hip hop, right? Everybody's familiar with hip hop. Well, if you look at the early hip hop, it had little, right? The 80s hip hop, little about incarceration. Once the 90s kicks in, all the hip hop is engendered with incarceration. You can cite from Eazy-E to Tupac to all that. That's culture. You see? They're speaking about reality, what's happening, right? You look at the lyrics, everything from Snoop Dogg all the way to, you know, you can keep on going even to this present day, right? Incarceration is there. So it's already even in the music.
As I touched on in my previous answer, incarceration is so aligned or such a recapitulation of slavery in my consciousness. And as I see it, that system particularly is about creating fear in everyone else. So the scene that comes up in my consciousness is in 12 Years a Slave, Solomon did something that the slave owner considered to be egregious. And he doesn't hang him completely, but he hangs him so that he has to be on his tiptoes. And what I remember so startling in that scene is the rest of the slaves walking around and just sort of looking, knowing that they could not do anything. For me, when I see a man sent to the hole, when I see how we, even as an African community, treat those that go into prison, it's very much the same way. We are so fearful ourselves that it just begins to undermine our culture. It begins to undermine who we are because we are holding so much fear that what the system tells us, we will do this to you as well if you try to help them. So it's used as a system of creating fear in us, and it does undermine our culture and undermines our way of being a village, undermines our way of being together.
I resonate with a lot of what you're saying, and I think as somebody who writes about fear all day long, Anne writes about fear of deportation and self-policing, right? So like the effects of having detention centers, concentration camps where children and human beings are being incarcerated and dehumanized and oppressed, and the consequences of being incarcerated leading to physical symptoms that do lead to death. I think one of the comments that was made that resonated with me was with communities that are not, so immigrant and documented communities that are not incarcerated, feeling this high level of fear of being deported, being detained, right? So this feeling of self-policing that comes, whether it be, I cannot speak my language in a community setting. That level of self-policing is a direct effect of having people being incarcerated. And so I think for me, when we think about, yes, the fear that our family members, that our community members are experiencing as a result of the existence of prisons, of detention centers, of concentration camps, we can start to see how people, right, become oppressed and almost self-police, self-deport because a system has gotten so chronic and that fear has gotten so intense that we cannot move around, right? So our mobilization, our mental, physical, emotional mobilization becomes paralyzed because of this high chronic level of fear that can result from just knowing that because of your skin color, because of your language, you can be picked up and incarcerated. So I think that that's where I see sort of the parallels in both communities that are incarcerated and experiencing levels of fear, right, that fairly so, and also communities that are not in prison but are also experiencing these levels of almost incarceration as well.
Thank you. So we do want to open up some questions for the audience, for the panelists. You guys got some papers, so if you do have some questions, now is the time.
It's more of a comment. Thank you all everyone, for coming out. My name is Romina. What resonated was with a lot of things that you said, but one thing that wasn't spoken, and this is for me, I'm a formerly incarcerated student, was the stigma that comes with women being incarcerated, right? And the mental trauma that they go through, right? For me, seeing pregnant women, having them go through pregnancy, have their babies, and have their children taken away, how that might affect their mental wellness, being torn away from your child as soon as they're born, right? Also, the stigma that we don't speak about women being incarcerated. I feel it gets overlooked because so many men are incarcerated, we forget about the women population, right? And I'm also a lesbian, I identify as a lesbian, right? So a lot of the things that I see or I saw going in there was 90% of the people in there are in there for drug charges, right? And when you see them coming down from certain drugs, you see like what it does mentally to even people around them. That like you have to live in a space where you're not accustomed to, in a sense that I don't do drugs, right? So seeing that and not have anyone speak on that, it's just like, it gets overlooked, and this is why it gets overlooked, because we don't speak on it. And it's almost acceptable to not speak about women being incarcerated. But it also does follow you, like mentally, like, because it's not being spoken, it's like we're also being forgotten about, and we shouldn't. Because that conversation also needs to be held.
Thank you, Amina.
And as they say, you should bring your chair and put it here and make yourself here at the table, right? So I appreciate your comment and standing up. So thank you.
Thank you.
I do as well, and certainly when I'm speaking, women are in my consciousness as well, but I do think this is a patriarchal culture, and unfortunately those neural pathways are so trod that we sometimes don't say it because we're so used to thinking in the male. So one, to you, the woman that's in you, and the women out here in the audience, I just want to say, yes, of course, so much of the devastation that has happened through these horrible systems of incarceration and oppression, the women have suffered immeasurably from that. Certainly the taking children from women has happened, I think, from the time all of this has occurred, and that is brutal and, of course, must fracture a person in immeasurable ways. So I'm always trying to work on my language and not being so male-centered, but I'm still getting there. So please accept my apology for the things I said and know that, yes, the women that are incarcerated, raped, brutalized, colonized, children taken away, that is so much an important thing to always have in the forefront of consciousness.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm all for restructuring the prison system. I think it's done a lot of damage to our community. I think oftentimes we look at it as, we talk about rehabilitation, but I think a lot of people haven't been habilitated. You know? So we talk about, so the model just needs to be redone. I mean, there's a lot of people who, you know, we need to start with a habilitation model. The other thing, I live in West Oakland where I've been for 13 years. Yesterday, we had a gunfight, 10:30 in the morning, 3 blocks from my house. 6 days before that, a gun battle, 2 blocks. I counted, I don't know, 10 shells in the street. Somebody was having a shootout in the street. So my point is that I think we need to separate. And I think that there are some people in our society who are causing trauma. And I feel and most of the people in my community, 90-some% of them, they're law-abiding, and I feel for the kids, the parents who can't let their kids come out on the street and jump rope and do all these kind of things. So my point is that we really need to focus, and the Boston ceasefire model does that. It focuses on the real hard, the people who are using guns, shooting indiscriminately. I think there's a place for people. I don't know how we treat that problem, but I don't think that those type of people deserve to be in our community. And so when the conversation about prison comes up, that's a conversation that's not comfortable for people, you know. But as a resident who's been dealing with it for 14 years, the gun, I mean, I hear some guns that are so powerful. I'm sitting in my house, my living room, I hear them 2 blocks away. It sounds like they're very powerful. So I just want to put that out there, you know, that this is a problem, and maybe you all have some feedback on that element and what we need to do with that, because, you know, the people in the community are afraid to speak up about it. So, a lot of us, you know, but it is an issue. It is an issue when you for people who want to go out in their backyards. I mean, I lived that, you know, I have lived it, and I know some of my neighbors have. And anyway, you know, I'm just saying that it's an issue.
No, thank you for your comment, because that's a huge part of our assessment when a kid or when a youth comes into custody and the case has to be presented to the DA. All of those things have to be considered. The status of the kid. Then we have to talk to the victim. Sometimes there are victims of crimes, and all those things have to be balanced, whether this youth stays in custody or if this youth is released from custody. And it is a balancing act when you do have a kid that's committed a heinous crime, is what we would say, you know, a real crime. That what do we do with this youth? But this same youth is in their room crying in the fetus position like a baby, and they just, you know, did something that some person is in the hospital, life is hanging in the balance, and we're not sure if we're going to get the call that this person died or this person is going to be paralyzed for life or whatever. Those cases come in sometime, and when you look at the youth, when they're inside and they're just like, I can't sit in this cell, I can't be in this condition, it's a balancing act. And that's where, when we have to say, we have to get the mental health people into inside with us to work with this youth, because now we have to balance, is the community safe before we release this youth back into the community? So that is something that needs to be on the table when we're talking about, and I do agree, the reform, absolutely. No, not at all. I know, I absolutely agree with you. Not all of them that come through. We have honor roll students who come through, you know, so, you know, we have kids that are on their way to college. They're not bad in the sense of, but they've made a choice that have brought them to our attention, so we have to address that issue, and it becomes that balancing act. Yeah, do we see the disparity of the kids who are of color, not even given the balancing of looking at everything for the crime they committed? Is more kids of color coming through that are not on the honor roll or not on their way to college, and how do we balance that out? But including the victim, we have to include the victim. I'm not sure if there's anybody here who's been a victim of someone committing a crime, or even been a victim of a mental health person that was in custody and that was released. That has to be addressed, and it has to be looked, because should I be afraid to be on the BART train? Should I be afraid to get off the BART and go to my car because someone or something is going to happen? So it is a balancing act that has to be included in the reform of a prison, so that our communities can be more healthy. We all, you know, accept that sometimes prison is a state of mind. You don't have to be in a facility blocked behind bars, but it's a state of mind that you live in, that you're a prisoner just in your own mind, which makes you vulnerable to not considering me or considering your neighbor or considering the person that's sitting across from you on the bus. So yeah, thank you for that comment.
Thank you all. One more question.
Some of the issues that we get faced with, and I think that's why we're always like a little bit too late when issues happen in our community. And I think like gun violence is something serious, especially in our community. So, but I think one of my comments is, how do we be proactive and not saying gun violence is the issue we need to tackle? What's the issue before gun violence happens that we need to tackle? You know what I mean? So kind of solving that issue before it even occurs, right? And in that same sense, my question to the panelists is, in that same sense, what's the issue that we need to start solving right now or start getting ahead of that's after incarceration and mental health, right? Because I think that's dealing with incarceration, or that's helping people cope with it, but what's after that? What do we need to do to make sure our community is prepared for the next attack, you know what I mean, on our community? And what is that issue, and what do we need to start doing now to prepare for it?
Thank you for the question and comment. Again, my name is Eddie Zhang, and my pronoun is he, him, his. And I think, you know, the first thing I would say that is we have to decolonize our minds, right? I mean, that has to be the piece, because, you know, when we talk about the culture of rape or culture of genocide, you know, like there are too many struggles and too much trauma that's going on that we can't even name, like, to be inclusive, right? I mean, the first thing is, like, we just had a celebration, so-called, of the Indigenous Peoples' Day, right? But, you know, where's the indigenous people whose land that we are standing on, or sitting on, or occupying on? That's never been talked about, right? Or when they talk about it, it's almost like, you know, we just want to acknowledge it and move on, and not really truly understand the structure of imperialism and colonization that has created this mental health trauma in all of our communities, right? So that's on a philosophical level, a structural level, and a historical level. That's undeniable, right? Then secondly, all the solutions that we're creating right now, most of the time are Band-Aid solutions. But Band-Aid solution because we still operate under the structure of capitalism, racism, and imperialism. And that's something that we're not getting away from. Unless we actively work together to decolonize as a mind, decolonize the institution of education that excludes people of color from being in this space. I mean, those are the real questions, right? But when it comes to mental health support, it's kind of normalized in a way that is disempowering, just like violence is normalized. We expect a response to be violent, right? And it's not really focused on restorative justice or transformative justice that is rooted in culture, rooted in alternatives to violence, rooted in love and compassion. Because those are things that have been taken away from all of us. So, I mean, I think that's the thing that we have to really consider, right? Like, that's why I always appreciate Bob Marley for saying that emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds. How do we free our minds? Because until that happens, we'll continue to operate under this structure that limited our imagination, like what is possible. How do we dream beyond what is impossible? Because we are conditioned, and we can no longer be conditioned, and we have to bring it out. And that's why we're having this type of space and this type of dialogue, but there's never enough time, right? There's never enough time for us to talk about the trauma. Every time that we go into a focus group, a support group, or a conference, you know, like the people who are impacted, it's always about venting. And the reason why they're venting and they're sharing the trauma because they've been denying a voice. There was no voice. It's the same as the Asian American Pacific Islander community, right? For 14 years of my life, when I was incarcerated, my parents never say anything to anyone that I was incarcerated, because it's a cultural shame. We don't want to talk about it. We only talk about the good things. Let's not talk about the bad things. So then we don't get the culturally competent support service that we need in our community. So that's why the mental health, is the stigmas comes with it, right? So I appreciate everybody's engagement and presence here, because the solution has to come from all of us, and not any one of us.
Thank you,
If I
Eddie.
could just add really quickly, I appreciate the theoretical concept, right, of decolonization. I think if we bring it to the mental health piece, the clinical piece, if you will, the key word here is healing, right? Because we also cannot apply a Western white psychology to try to explain the mental presentation of communities of color. We cannot do that, right? That would be reinforcing the very same trauma that we're speaking to. So I think for me, as a practitioner of Western white psychology, I'm very careful when I try to explain or try to conceptualize or theorize the problems that exist in communities of color. And I think the key word here is healing. And healing comes from knowing your culture. It goes back to knowing your history, where you come from. And going back to in Lakesh, you are the other me, right? And we heal through each other. We heal through community work. And that is the work of our ancestors. That is not the work of Western psychology. That is the work of our ancestors. And when we begin to understand that power is within ourselves, that's when we begin to decolonize our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. Because we do live in these structures that are meant to keep us down all the time. And so when we can liberate and decolonize ourselves from that thought, that's where the healing comes in, and that's where the interpersonal work can start to begin to happen. So I think that is one thing that I'm taking away from this conversation and this discussion around just healing. When we talk about mental health, is really going back into your inner home and what that means for yourself.
Thank you, Liliana. And then we're just going to have our Alex Garcia finish up the last word.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. So I just want to, echo my colleagues here. Going along the question of healing, going along the question of decolonization, right? I also want to just add, right, really something really challenging to all of you, right? Right? I'm an abolitionist. I believe we don't need the prisons. Simple as that. Can you imagine this world without this prison? Right? And that is actually challenging. It's really, on the one hand, it's kind of simple, but it's hard because we're we imagine this society, right, to exist alongside a prison, and that has been the problem. My brother called it colonization, right? You look at captivity from day one, right? It has existed, and it has always been viewed as a necessity, right? But if you really think about even the prisons, I just gave you, a trajectory. There was a rise, a prison boom, when there was actually a decline, right, in crime. So look it up yourself if you don't believe it. But that's one step towards decolonization, right? In other words, we call it. I'm part of an abolitionist group. We're abolitionists, but why? Because we know that the prison system is obsolete. And if it's not obsolete, then it's because it's working in favor of the imperial project, and therefore it is actually doing what it's supposed to do, right? Which is the continuity of, creating colonial subjects. At the same time, creating disenfranchisement, mass disenfranchisement, if you think about it, right? So again, right, why do we have to imagine the existence of these penal institutions? Yes, just to respond to my brother, there are certain conditions that exist in that way. I live in West Oakland, so I know what you're talking about, right? I hear it all the time. But I like what my brother right here said, right? Let's think about what happened before, right? And it is up to us, right? It is up to us to come together and think about it. But the main one that's hard for everybody to grasp is that, we don't even need this system. And yet we somehow feel that it's part and parcel of our daily life, right?
Thank you.
If I could jump
Thank
in
you
for a
again to all the panelists.
So big hand to some amazing, woo, what a day. just like an amazing, and our amazing young MC, future playwright, poet, graduate from at least BCC and further, right? And further, yes.